"I'm pregnant," Layla said, her voice trembling with happiness. Andrew froze. The world around me froze. His breathing hitched. His chest was squeezed by an invisible vice. Her words echoed in his ears, and the doctor's words floated before his eyes, still fresh, like a red-hot blade piercing his consciousness. "Unfortunately, you are infertile. You will never have children." "Andrew," Layla looked at him with concern. "Did you hear? I'm pregnant. We're having a baby." His lips trembled slightly, but he could not squeeze out a word, because he knew the truth. This child is not his. Andrew Rivers is a 35-year-old man whose life, at first glance, seemed ideal. Tall, athletic, with sharp features, gray eyes, and short dark hair. He had that masculine charisma that attracted people. He had the confidence of a man accustomed to being in control, and this quality helped him not only in his career, but also in everyday life. Andrew was a man who never jumped to conclusions and knew how to control his emotions, which allowed him to remain calm even in the most tense situations. He worked in finance, holding the position of investment analyst at one of the prestigious banks in New York. His ability to see the future, calculate risks, and make cold-blooded decisions made him one of the best in the business. People in the office respected him, some even feared him, knowing that Andrew never forgives mistakes. He was calculating, collected, and ruthless in a professional environment. It was these qualities that helped him achieve success, but they also created the aura of a cold person around him. He didn't try to be the life of the party, but his opinions were always valued, and his analytical skills brought huge profits to his employers. Through discipline and dedication to his work, he earned a lot of money and was able to afford a luxurious lifestyle. But at home, he was different. His wife, Layla Rivers, knew a different side of him. She was 30 years old and the epitome of femininity and elegance. Thick brown hair, brown eyes, slender but appetizing body, she was the woman that men always turned to. She worked as an interior designer and had an innate sense of style that was evident in everything from her clothes to the impeccably furnished home in which they lived. Layla was not only beautiful, but also an intelligent, ambitious, capable woman who strived for independence. Despite the fact that Andrew earned enough to provide for their family, she did not want to be just the wife of a wealthy man and built her own career. Their marriage lasted 6 years. All this time they tried to create an ideal family. Their home was full of love, passion, and understanding. Or so Andrew thought. He was sure that Layla was his only one, his devoted wife, his support. They were the couple that others looked at with envy, successful, beautiful, loving each other. They often traveled, dined in expensive restaurants, and attended social events. Friends admired their harmony, and no one would have thought that problems could be hidden under this ideal shell. Andrew Rivers was born into a family that did not know wealth, but was not poor either. His parents, George and Margaret Rivers, lived in a small town in Illinois. George worked as an auto mechanic, and Margaret was a school teacher. Their life was simple but stable. They could not afford luxury, but they always found an opportunity to give their son comfort and love. George was a man of the old school, stern, taciturn, with iron discipline. He taught his son that the world is a place where the strong survive, and that pity is weakness. Often, when Andrew gave a bad grade or complained about unfairness, George would just shake his head gloomily and say, "Life doesn't have to be fair. You either fight or you lose." His words became something of a mantra for Andrew, which over time became ingrained in his mind. Margaret, on the other hand, was softer. She believed in goodness and sincerity, tried to instill humanity in her son, but her influence was often neutralized by George's harsh methods. She supported Andrew in his endeavors, inspired him to read books, study, and dream. It was thanks to her that he developed a taste for knowledge and a desire to get out of their provincial town. Often in the evenings, she sat next to him, reading his books about great people who achieved success despite difficulties. These stories ignited in the boy a desire to become something more than just a continuation of his father's work. Andrew was the only child in the family, and this placed a special responsibility on him. From early childhood, he realized that he had a responsibility to meet the expectations of his parents. His father wanted him to continue the family business and become a car mechanic, but Andrew dreamed of something else. He saw himself in a big city among skyscrapers, in a world where decisions were measured in millions of dollars and not in hourly wages in a workshop. Sometimes at night, he looked through articles about finance, the stock exchange, and business, imagining how he would someday move in the world of big money. Andrew's childhood was spent in constant conflict between two worlds: the world of his father, demanding strictness and discipline, and the world of his mother, filled with dreams and hopes. These two influences strengthened his character, teaching him both prudence and the ability to hide his emotions. He wasn't popular at school, but he didn't stay in the shadows either. He chose his own path, the path of an ambitious loner who sets a goal and goes towards it, despite the difficulties. As he grew older, it became clear that Andrew would not work in an auto repair shop. He studied hard, worked part-time to save up for future investments, and also looked for any opportunity to escape from his hometown. After school, he entered the university, choosing the Faculty of Finance, which was the first step towards realizing his dream. It was during these early years that he learned the main lesson: you can only rely on yourself. If he wants to break out of the countryside and build the life of his dreams, he must become the best. And he promised himself that it would be so. This vow became his guiding star, and he was not going to deviate from it. Andrew Rivers was never a typical teenager. At school, he was neither one of the excellent students, nor one of the rebels, nor one of those who always remained in the shadows. He kept himself to himself, did not try to make many friends, but also did not allow himself to be humiliated. His classmates respected him for his composure, for his ability to take a punch, and for the keen intelligence that he demonstrated not only in school, but also in everyday life. He was always alert, analyzed the situation, and thought through his actions several steps ahead. However, there was one person with whom he did become close: Michael Carter. Michael was the complete opposite of Andrew: easygoing, charismatic, able to find a common language with anyone. He knew how to charm people, to achieve his goals not by force, but by charm. Their friendship began by chance after a school dispute in which they found themselves on the same side. Over time, they became inseparable. Andrew was attracted to Michael by his ability to manipulate people, and Michael was attracted to Andrew's prudence and cold logic. Studying was easy for Andrew, but he never strived to be the best student. A confident average result was enough for him. But he excelled in other things: in strategic thinking and the ability to understand people. He observed how social mechanisms work, who and how rises to the top of the school hierarchy, and drew conclusions. Michael excelled in communication. He was the life of the party, made acquaintances easily, and always knew how to win people over. Together, they became a kind of duo. Andrew made plans, and Michael helped bring them to life. The turning point in his life occurred at the age of 16. One of the few friends he trusted betrayed him by leaking important information about his school project to competitors. This was the first serious blow for Andrew, but also an important lesson. Michael was then the only one who supported him and helped him get out of the situation, proving that he really was his friend. Andrew realized that you can only trust the most trusted people, but even with them, you need to keep your eyes open. This incident strengthened his character and made him understand that in this world everyone is for himself, and that the weak always lose. From that moment on, he began to strengthen his will, develop patience and composure. His emotional armor became stronger. It was then that he first realized what he wanted in life. He realized that he was not satisfied with mediocrity, that he did not want to be just another guy from the province who would stay in his town and work for someone. He wanted more. He craved power, money, and influence. He wanted to become a person for whom any door opens, a person who cannot be broken. His path to success began small. He began to study economics, financial schemes, and biographies of great entrepreneurs. He watched how people who achieved wealth worked and found patterns in their stories. He devoted every free minute to self-development, making a plan for the future, knowing that one day he would break out of the province and enter a world where big money would circulate. Michael also shared his ambitions, but always did it with ease, without making any visible effort. They both dreamed of getting out of the province, but while Andrew achieved this through strict control and discipline, Michael preferred workarounds. Adolescence for Andrew was a time of character formation. He became more reserved, less trusting, but at the same time incredibly purposeful. He learned to play the long game, understand people, and use their weaknesses to his advantage. He realized that life is a chessboard, and he intends to become a grandmaster in this game. And next to him was always Michael, the one who would later betray him in the most painful way. Andrew Rivers's first love came to him unexpectedly, like all strong feelings that cannot be predicted. He was 17 when he met Emily, a girl who immediately fell into his soul. She was a year younger, with long blonde hair, a sincere smile, and eyes full of curiosity about life. There was something special about her, a gentleness, kindness, and lightness that was so different from his own harsh view of the world. Emily didn't play games. She didn't pretend to be inaccessible. She was just being herself, and it drove Andrew crazy. In her presence, he felt different for the first time, not that calculating guy who always thinks through his moves, but just a teenager who can enjoy the moment. She infected him with her cheerfulness, laughed at his seriousness, and made him see the world differently. When they both turned 18, their relationship moved to a new level. Their first time happened in the summer, in a quiet house by the lake, where Emily's family spent the holidays. The two of them were there, hidden from the whole world. The evening air was warm, the windows were slightly open, and the quiet splash of water could be heard outside. Emily looked at him with eyes full of desire and trust. She whispered quietly, "I want it, Andrew. I want you." Her fingers trembled as she unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his hot skin. Her fingers trembled as she unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his hot skin. Andrew ran his hands over her waist, feeling her breathing become faster. The kisses became greedy and deep. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, sliding his lips along her neck. "Make me yours." Her voice was filled with anticipation and slight trembling. Their bodies merged into one, and when he entered her, she whispered his name, arching towards him. Every movement was new, every sound was memorable. Their rhythm was cautious at first, but soon turned into a whirlwind of passion. Emily scratched his back, her lips leaving hot marks on his chest. Andrew felt his body being immersed in this sensation, in this wave that captured them both. He had never experienced anything like this before. It wasn't just desire, it was union. When it was all over, they lay next to each other, holding hands, breathing heavily, feeling the heat of each other's skin. It was incredible, Emily breathed, her lips touching his shoulder. Andrew smiled, pulling her closer. "I will never forget this moment," he whispered, inhaling the scent of her hair. Emily smiled, snuggling closer, her fingers lazily running over his chest. He knew that this moment would stay with him forever. After their first intimacy, Andrew and Emily's relationship blossomed with renewed vigor. They spent every free minute together, enjoying every moment. Their connection was strong, filled with passion and tenderness. They discussed the future, made plans, dreamed that someday they would be able to live together, travel, and be happy. Andrew felt that for the first time in his life, he had found someone with whom he could build something real. Emily became for him not only a lover, but also a friend, a person he could trust. She saw him as he really was, without masks and calculated strategies. In her eyes, he was not only smart and ambitious, but also gentle, caring, and real. One day, looking at her, he even thought that perhaps she was the one with whom he could connect his life. The idea of marriage, which had previously seemed something distant to him, now did not seem so crazy. He imagined their future, a cozy home, warm evenings, trips together. But fate prepared a cruel lesson for him. One evening, returning from his part-time job, he decided to drop by her place without warning to arrange a surprise. Already at the entrance to her house, he noticed an expensive car parked in front of her entrance. His heart sank with an unpleasant feeling, but he forced himself to come closer. The light was on in the window of her room, and he saw silhouettes. His breath caught. Emily was there, in the arms of another man. Tall, well-dressed, confident. Andrew stood in the shadows, watching her laugh, her hands sliding over his chest, their lips meeting in a kiss. He didn't need more proof. Everything he believed in collapsed in an instant. Anger and pain overwhelmed him, but he did not make a scene. The next day he met with Emily. She tried to make excuses, saying that it was a mistake, that she was confused. But Andrew didn't listen. He looked at her with a cold determination that he had never known in himself before. "I loved you, Emily," he said, "but now I know that trusting people is a weakness." She cried, but he didn't give up, didn't give her a chance. He turned around and walked away, leaving her in tears. A few months later, he learned that she had married the same rich man whom he had seen in her arms. They had a magnificent wedding, and photos of her in an expensive white dress flashed on social networks. He never saw her in person again, but that lesson stayed with him forever. He simply turned around and left, making a promise to himself. A promise that he will never allow himself to be weak again. That no one else could ever betray him like that again. After Emily's betrayal, Andrew realized that the only thing he could rely on was his own strength and determination. He no longer allowed himself weaknesses, no longer allowed his emotions to control him. Instead, he focused on becoming the best, most successful, most influential person in his field. The first step was university. He entered one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the country, where he studied economics and finance. Studying was not difficult for him. He had an analytical mind, quickly absorbed knowledge, and knew how to use it in practice. He didn't just study, he built his future empire. He found useful connections, studied the market, looked for loopholes and subtleties that could give him an advantage. Unlike his peers, who spent their time partying and having fun, Andrew lived differently. He worked, took on any part-time jobs, and immersed himself in investing. The first transactions were small, but he quickly learned to manage money so that it worked for him. He took risks, but he did it calculatedly. Every step he took was carefully considered, every decision was thought out. After graduating from university, he got a job at one of the largest investment banks in New York. There, he faced the harsh reality of the financial world, a world where the strong devour the weak, where emotions mean losing. But he was not weak. He was ready. He used the same methods as his bosses, learned from the best, manipulated, and calculated several steps ahead. Andrew didn't just work, he rose. He saw others make mistakes and used them to his advantage. He made deals that brought the bank millions and his power and respect. People began to fear him, but they also respected him. He became what he always wanted to be, a man who could not be broken. But deep down in his soul, he remembered why he was doing this. He remembered the pain he felt when he stood under Emily's windows. He remembered his promise to never be weak again. He no longer believed in love, in sincerity, in devotion. For him, there was only one thing: success, and he was going to take from life everything he deserved. Life taught Andrew that every achievement comes at the cost of losses. He achieved a lot, but fate prepared a new blow for him. The year he got his first big promotion at the bank, he received a call that changed everything. "Andrew." The voice on the other end was trembling. "Your mother, she's gone. The world has shrunk to one point." His mother, Margaret, was always that quiet light for him that never seemed to go out. She supported him, believed in him, even when he himself doubted. And now she is gone. Doctors said she had pancreatic cancer that had gone undetected for a long time. She knew about her diagnosis, but hid it from everyone, not wanting her family to suffer. When the disease entered its final stage, it was already too late. She hid for a long time that she felt bad, not wanting to bother her son. Andrew was tormented by the thought, if he had been there, if he had noticed the warning signs, everything might have been different. He returned to his hometown for the funeral, where he met his father. George looked broken. The eyes did not have the steely determination that Andrew remembered from childhood. He held on, but it was clear. Margaret's death killed everything in him that made him strong. The father did not cry, but his hands trembled as he threw a handful of earth onto the coffin. After the funeral, Andrew stayed at his parents' house, trying to console his father. But nothing helped. George started drinking. At first it was unnoticed, a couple of glasses in the evening, but over time alcohol became his only way to cope with the pain. He stopped taking care of himself, about the house, about everything. Andrew tried to fight. He hired a nurse and offered to move in with him, but his father just waved her off. "I lived my life, son. Now I have nothing to hold on to," he said one day, putting another bottle on the table. 6 months later, Andrew returned to his home again, this time for his father's funeral. George died of cirrhosis of the liver. He never got over the loss of Margaret. Standing at the fresh grave, Andrew realized that he was truly alone now. He no longer had a family, no one for whom he could build something. Only him and his own path. Only success, which now seemed not like victory, but the only meaning in life. The death of his parents changed Andrew completely. Now he has no one left who could be his support or weakness. He realized, from now on he is his own father, mother, and best friend. The only thing he could rely on was his own mind and cold calculation. He made a firm decision, never again to let his feelings guide him, not to make mistakes, not to become attached to anyone. He threw himself into his work. Now there were no breaks, no rest, no useless emotions. All he has left is the desire to achieve more, to move forward, to take what is his from life. He became merciless, someone who was respected but feared. The first few years in the world of high finance were a real challenge for him. He worked 18 hours a day, giving himself no break, immersing himself in every detail, every opportunity, every chance that could move him higher. In the financial world of New York, he began to quickly rise through the ranks. His acumen, analytical mind, and absolute equanimity made him the best in the business. He made deals that others considered impossible, calculated situations several moves ahead, and did not hesitate to get out of the way of those who stood in his way. He learned to see lies, betrayal, and greed in people at first sight, and used other people's weaknesses to his advantage. The first time he realized that power brings pleasure happened during an important deal. His rival, a man with a reputation as a ruthless gambler, tried to frame Andrew. But he was smarter. He collected incriminating evidence, revealed his opponent's dirty schemes, and ensured that his reputation was destroyed. Soon he was fired, lost contact, and was forced to leave the city. This was the first true feeling of triumph, not just victory, but the complete destruction of the enemy. He realized that his power is not just money, but influence, fear, the ability to break other people's destinies the same way they once broke him. Andrew watched this with quiet satisfaction. He no longer felt pity. No one showed pity for him when he lost everything. Now he has learned to play other people's games, but according to his own rules. He didn't trust anyone, didn't let anyone get closer to him than necessary. People became resources, tools, opportunities for him. If someone could not be useful, he simply disappeared from his life. Women no longer evoked the same emotions in him. He enjoyed them, but did not become attached. Now they were just a pleasant distraction to be used, but never allowed into your life. They came and went. Their beauty and words meant nothing to him. He realized that trusting anyone was weakness, and he could no longer afford weakness. Love and affection were illusions that could only destroy his built world. Soon a new person appeared in his life. An influential businessman, one of those who controlled the hidden flows of money, offered him a chance. This was not just another contract, it was a ticket to the closed world of the elite, in which truly high stakes were played. Andrew was faced with a choice, to stay where he was already king, or to step even further into a world where decisions were measured in billions. Before the meeting, he stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection. His eyes became cold, his gaze steely. He was no longer the young man who dreamed of love, family, and a bright future. He was a predator ready to take control of this world. He already knew the answer. It had been several years since Andrew had last seen Michael. Their paths diverged. Michael went to work abroad, and Andrew completely immersed himself in the world of finance and power. They didn't keep in touch, and to be honest, Andrew didn't even think about his former friend. Until today. He sat in the dim light of an upscale Manhattan bar, enjoying a rare evening without business meetings or deals. The cold whiskey pleasantly burned his throat, and music sounded in his head, which he almost did not hear. He was simply resting, giving himself a minute of respite, until he heard a familiar voice. "Andrew, is it really you?" came from behind him. He turned slowly and met the gaze of a man he had not seen for many years. Michael Carter looked even better than before, an expensive suit, well-groomed appearance, a confident smile. It seemed that life was more than favorable to him. "Michael," Andrew said calmly, raising his glass. "Long time no see." "Yes, a damn long time ago. Damn, we should drink at the meeting. You don't mind if I join, do you?" Andrew motioned for him to join the table. He was calm, even friendly, but something stirred inside him. Old memories, hidden pain, and the feeling that this meeting was not accidental. "What have you been doing all these years?" Michael asked, taking a sip of whiskey. "I worked, built a career, and earned money." "Everything is as usual," Andrew replied. "Oh yes, you have always been the one who goes to the end. I saw your name in business circles. They say you're a serious player now." Michael grinned, shaking the glass in his hand. "They say, you know, Michael, that in our world, rumors are not always true." Andrew leaned forward slightly, carefully observing the expression on his friend's face. "What do you say to yourself? Have you become what you always wanted to be?" Michael narrowed his eyes. "I achieved what I wanted," Andrew answered briefly. "And you? Did you get married and have children?" Michael chuckled. "Yes, he was married, but we divorced about a year ago. It didn't work out, you know how it happens. At first, everything seemed perfect, but over time, we became strangers. I was too focused on work, and well, let's just say she had her own interests. In general, everyone went their own way." Andrew nodded, taking another sip of whiskey. "So you're free again," he said with a slight smile. "Yes, but you know, sometimes it seems that being alone is easier. No drama, no strings attached." Michael leaned back in his chair. "And you? Still lonely?" "I'm not the kind of person who builds a family, Michael. I have other priorities." Andrew took a leisurely sip of whiskey without looking away. "Family is a weakness, and I can't afford to be weak." "Tough, as always," Michael chuckled. "But you have always been like this. Hasn't changed." "People don't change, Michael. They simply become who they were meant to be." Michael thought for a moment, but then smiled and raised his glass. "Okay, let's drink to that. For those who remain true to themselves." "I'll drink to that," Andrew nodded, clinking his glass against his friend's glass. At that moment, a light sound of broken glass was heard in the bar. They both turned around. The young woman at the next table dropped her glass, sheepishly apologizing to the bartender. Michael glanced at her and grinned. "Well, it looks like someone has already had too much." Andrew just glanced at her and returned to his glass. For now, his interest was focused only on the conversation with Michael. The meeting after so many years could not have been a mere coincidence. The bar was beginning to fill with the night crowd, those looking for adventure, light entertainment, and oblivion in alcohol. Andrew listened to Michael with half an ear, not really delving into his stories about working abroad, but his attention was drawn to the scene that unfolded a few meters from their table. The woman, the same one who had accidentally broken a glass earlier, was staggering at the bar, apparently having too much to drink. Long dark hair hid part of her face, and her tight dress emphasized her impeccable figure. A man in an expensive suit stood too close to her, brazenly touching her hand, leaning too low, whispering something in her ear. "Baby, don't break down. I just want to see you off." His low voice was heard. "Please, leave me alone." The woman's voice trembled, but whether it was anger, fear, or alcohol intoxication was difficult to say. Andrew silently put his glass on the table and stood up. He couldn't stand those types people who took advantage of other people's weaknesses. Michael gave him a puzzled look, but said nothing. Coming closer, Andrew easily took the stranger by the elbow and said in a firm, confident voice, "Everything is fine. Does this guy bother you?" The woman looked up at him with a hazy look, her eyes shining with tears. She tried to say something, but only took a shaky breath. The man who pestered her frowned with displeasure. Listen, buddy, you're out of business. The girl and I get along great, so get lost. The man tried to push Andrew away, but he didn't budge. She's made it clear she's not interested, Andrew replied coldly, so your evening is over. Go ahead. He began, but Andrew's look, full of icy calm, made him change his mind. The man grinned, took a step back, and then waved his hand and turned around, disappearing into the crowd. Andrew turned his gaze to the woman. She could barely stand. Are you okay? He asked, softening his voice a little. I... Her lips trembled, and then she suddenly covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and it was obvious that the cause of her condition was far from just alcohol. Andrew silently took off his jacket and threw it over her shoulders. He now understood why she looked distracted and tense even when he noticed her broken glass. Apparently, she had a difficult evening from the very beginning. Let's get out of here. You need to go home. She shook her head. I can't. I don't want to go home. Where do you live? He asked calmly, but in response, he heard only a quiet sob. Her hands were shaking, and when she tried to take the phone out of her purse, it simply slipped out and fell to the floor. Andrew picked it up, saw that the screen was cracked, and handed it back to her. Okay, then let's go to my place. She didn't even object. Andrew gently supported her as he led her to the exit. Inside, he didn't know why he intervened, why he suddenly decided to help. Maybe it was just an instinctive aversion to people like the guy at the bar. Or maybe something in her tear-stained eyes made him not leave her alone that night. They went outside, where the humid air of the New York night cooled their heated thoughts. Andrew opened the door to his car, put the woman in the front seat, made sure she was buckled up, and got behind the wheel. What is your name? He asked, starting the engine. She was silent for several seconds, as if deciding whether to tell him this. Layla, she finally whispered. Andrew nodded, remembering the name. It was new to him, but for some reason it gave rise to a strange feeling, as if fate had already woven it into his life. Layla, everything will be okay. Rest, sleep well. Tomorrow morning, we'll figure out what to do next. She didn't answer. She just pressed her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. The car smoothly drove onto the night highway, leaving behind the bar and all the fuss of that evening. The morning was quiet. The room was in darkness, with only faint rays of sunlight breaking through the curtains. Layla slowly opened her eyes, feeling weak and aching pain in her temples. My head was pounding, my mouth was dry, and my body felt heavy, as if it were lead. It took her a few seconds to realize that she was not at home. She sat up abruptly, looking around the room. Spacious but minimalist room, expensive furniture, dark walls. The smell of men's perfume mixed with the aroma of coffee, which came from somewhere in the kitchen. Her heart beat faster. Where is she? Panic began to set in, but before she could become completely agitated, the door opened slightly. Andrew stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. His face was calm and his gaze appraising. Are you awake? His voice was even, without unnecessary emotions. Layla blinked, remembering the events of last night. Bar, that vile guy who pestered her. Andrew. His calm, confident voice, the feeling of security as he led her to the car. Where am I? She asked hoarsely. I have. You weren't in the best condition, but you didn't want to go home, Andrew explained, handing her a cup. Do you want some water too? Layla took the coffee, her fingers trembling. Thank you. She took a sip, feeling the hot drink bring her life back. Then her eyes narrowed. You didn't take advantage of the situation? Her voice was weak, but disbelief flashed in her eyes. Andrew chuckled. No, he answered briefly. I'm not one to take advantage of someone else's weakness. Layla looked at him, appraising him. His calmness confused her. She is used to the men who are nearby at such moments, either trying to console or take advantage of her vulnerability. And this man just sat and looked at her, as if expecting her to start the conversation herself. What's happened? Andrew sat down opposite her, watching her intently. Layla took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. There was a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. I found my boyfriend in bed with my best friend. Her voice trembled, but she continued. They didn't even try to justify themselves. They just looked at me like I was interrupting their evening. She swallowed convulsively, the memories causing physical pain. I I just left and went to the bar. I wanted to forget. Get drunk so you don't feel this pain. But as you can see, everything didn't turn out quite as I planned. She smiled bitterly, but there were tears in her eyes. Andrew was silent, watching her. Her story did not surprise him. Betrayal, lies. It was all part of life, part of human nature. I know it sounds corny, Layla added, shaking her head. But I never thought this would happen to me. I trusted them both. Imagine, you come home, and there is your girlfriend with the person to whom you shared your most intimate thoughts. They didn't even move, didn't try to cover themselves or say anything. They just watched. Her voice broke, and she quickly wiped away the tears that had formed. They didn't even apologize. They just said that it happened that way. As if that makes a difference, Andrew took a sip of his coffee before answering. People betray Layla, especially those from whom you don't expect it. She looked at him as if trying to read something in his face. You speak as if you experienced it yourself. Andrew chuckled slightly, but didn't answer. His past was none of her business, at least for now. There was silence. Layla looked thoughtfully into her cup. Then, as if having made up her mind, she raised her eyes. Why did you help me? You could have just left without interfering. Andrew shrugged slightly. Maybe I just don't like bastards who take advantage of other people's weaknesses. Or maybe I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. She thought about his words. This man was a mystery, but there was something in his voice that made her feel safe. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me. Just try not to get into such situations again. She chuckled, but there was still sadness in her eyes. I'll try, but I still don't know how to move on. Andrew looked at her with a cold, but somehow understanding look. Start by drinking more coffee and collecting your thoughts. And then, you yourself will understand. Layla felt a little better after the coffee and shower Andrew suggested she take. Her head was still buzzing, but her mind was gradually clearing. Breakfast passed in silence. Andrew didn't ask too many questions, and Layla was in no hurry to share anything else. She was grateful for his silence. As she set the empty cup down on the table, she took a deep breath and looked up at Andrew. Thank you. For everything. Her voice was quiet but sincere. It's not worth it, he answered calmly. The main thing is that you come to your senses. Layla nodded, biting her lip as if wondering what to say next. Then she got up and walked to the door. I think it's time for me to go. She looked at him as if expecting him to say something. But Andrew just nodded. Fine. If you need help, you know where to find me. Layla tried to smile, but there was weariness in her eyes. She nodded and left, carefully closing the door behind her. The light smell of her perfume remained, barely perceptible, but clinging to something inside. Andrew looked at the table next to the sofa and noticed a thin silver bracelet. Apparently, Layla forgot him. He picked up the jewelry, twirling it in his fingers. Involuntarily, I kept my gaze on him longer than I should have. Why couldn't he just get her out of his head? He was not used to such thoughts. Women came and went, and he never clung to them. But now something was different. He ran his finger over the cool metal, then put the bracelet in his pocket. There was still Layla's scent in the air, and it was annoying. He didn't like it when thoughts about someone got stuck in his head, especially about a woman who, it seemed, shouldn't matter to him. The sharp ringing of the phone brought him out of his thoughts. Michael's name flashed on the screen. Well, how did it go? The friend's voice was tinged with slight mockery. Did you take her to bed? Andrew chuckled, leaning against the back of the couch. It's not that simple, Michael. Seriously? Michael laughed. Have you become sentimental? Or was she too difficult a target? Maybe it's just that not all women are created to be dragged, Andrew answered, looking at the bracelet in his hand. Michael was silent for a second and then snorted. Is that so? You intrigue me. Who is she? Nobody, Andrew snapped. An ordinary girl who finds herself in an unpleasant situation. Ordinary? Michael chuckled. Then why do you sound like you're still thinking about her? Andrew didn't answer. He himself didn't understand why it hurt him so much. He didn't know Layla and had no reason to think about her any further. But something wouldn't let go. He remembered her trembling fingers as she held the cup, her gaze filled with pain and disappointment. Forget it, Michael, he finally said. It doesn't matter. We'll see, Michael said mysteriously. Okay, I won't torture you. Meet me later. Yes, Andrew answered briefly and hung up the call. He looked at the bracelet again. Andrew didn't expect to see her again so soon. A week passed, and he almost convinced himself that Layla was just a chance encounter, a late-night visitor who left behind only a faint scent of perfume and a forgotten bracelet. He didn't try to look for it, didn't ask about it, but for some reason this bracelet was still in his drawer instead of ending up in the trash. That evening he went to a small cafe near the office. Usually he didn't eat in such places, preferring secluded restaurants or delivery to the office, but this time he just wanted to get out into the fresh air. He ordered black coffee and sat at a corner table by the window, looking at his phone. And then I saw her. Layla stood at the counter, placing her order. She was wearing a simple coat, dark jeans, and a sweater, but even in this casual look she looked elegant. His hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and his face showed no signs of the pain he had seen that night. It seemed that she had already dealt with her past. But when she turned around, her gaze accidentally fell on him. He noticed how she froze for a second. Her eyes reflected a whole range of emotions: surprise, confusion, and something else. She clearly didn't expect to meet him here so soon. Andrew watched her without looking away. He didn't know if she would come over or just pretend she didn't notice him. But after a few seconds, Layla made a decision. She took her coffee and walked towards him. Andrew, she said, coming closer. Layla, he nodded, putting the phone aside. I didn't expect to see you here. Me too, she grinned, sitting down opposite him. Small town, isn't it? He chuckled without correcting her, although New York was by no means a small city. How are you? He asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Better, she replied. Not perfect, but better. She cupped her cup with her hands as if trying to keep warm. Did you, by any chance, find my bracelet? She asked, throwing a quick glance at him. Andrew raised an eyebrow slightly, grinning. Maybe. He pulled a silver bracelet out of his pocket and put it on the table. Looks like he was waiting for you. Layla sighed with relief, carefully taking the jewelry in her hand. She ran her fingers over the metal as if it were some expensive artifact. Is he important to you? Andrew asked calmly, watching her reaction. Yes, she answered briefly. This is a gift from my mother. She died several years ago. I never took it off until. She fell silent, clearly referring to the night she got drunk and everything fell apart. Andrew nodded without saying anything. He understood that this bracelet was not just a decoration. Thank you for saving it, Layla said quietly, looking up. You're welcome, he replied. I think he should go to his owner. She smiled slightly, sincerely for the first time during this conversation. And at that moment Andrew realized that their meeting was not an accident. How are you? She asked, putting the cup aside. Everything is the same, he answered laconically. Do you always say so little? Layla grinned. Andrew lifted the corners of his lips in a slight smirk. Only when there is nothing to say. She shook her head, but couldn't help but smile. Have you already had breakfast? She asked unexpectedly. No. Layla thought for a moment and then nodded. Then let's have some more coffee. I have to thank you for not throwing away my bracelet. Andrew looked at her, assessing her again. Layla didn't look the same as she did that night. There was something different about her now. Calm, determination, or maybe just a desire to start from scratch. Okay, he said, let's have some more coffee. And when Layla smiled, he suddenly realized that this morning had become more interesting than he expected. Layla didn't think she would ever meet her ex again. She hoped that this phase of her life was behind her, buried with the pain of betrayal. But fate, it seems, decided to test her strength. Another week passed after meeting Andrew in the cafe, and life began to return to normal. Layla got a new job and tried to take her mind off the past and focus on the future. But everything changed one evening. She went into a small bar to meet a friend. I barely had time to order a glass of wine when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Layla, damn, is it really you? Jason's voice was full of surprise, but there was also awkwardness in it. She turned around sharply, her heart squeezing painfully in her chest. He stood before her, the man she had once loved, but now she could barely look him in the eyes without a flash of rage. Jason, she said dryly, what a surprise. I I didn't think I'd see you here, he smiled awkwardly, but his eyes glanced at her appraisingly. You look good. Thank you. Her voice was cold. What do you want? Jason took a step closer, leaning on the bar. He looked as confident as ever, but there was something akin to regret in his eyes. Layla, I want to talk. About us. About that night. I screwed up. I know I ruined everything. She felt a wave of anger rise within her. He spoke as if he accidentally spilled coffee and did not betray her with her best friend. Screwed up? She asked with a bitter smile. Is that what you call what you did? Jason sighed heavily. Look, I was an idiot. I don't want to make excuses. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Layla shook her head, not believing her ears. Sorry? Jason, you weren't sorry that night. And there was no regret afterwards. Why did you suddenly decide to make amends now? Because I miss you, he blurted out. Layla opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment a low, calm voice came from behind her. Is this guy bothering you? She shuddered and turned around. Andrew. He stood slightly behind her, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand, and looked at Jason as if he had already decided what to do with him. Jason frowned, giving Andrew a quick glance. Who the hell are you? Andrew took a step forward, creating an additional barrier between Layla and Jason. Someone who doesn't like it when women talk to trash, he answered calmly, looking Jason straight in the eyes. Layla froze, watching this scene. She hadn't expected Andrew to be here, but now his presence seemed oddly appropriate. He radiated confidence and calm, but there was a subtle threat in his voice. Jason clenched his jaw, clearly not used to being spoken to in this way. It's none of your business, buddy, he said coldly. Andrew grinned. You're wrong. Now this is exactly my business. The silence between them stretched like a string. Layla felt a strange feeling spreading in her chest, either relief or something else. Oh, so you're her hero now? Jason curled his lips into a smirk. It's funny. Do you even know what it is like? Or has she not yet shown you her whims? Layla flushed, but before she could say anything, Andrew stepped forward. I know enough to know that she deserves better than you. His voice was smooth, but there was steel in it. Jason chuckled, but his confidence was shaken. He looked at Layla, then back at Andrew. You know what, buddy? Take it. I'm no longer interested. Layla felt everything turn inside her. This man truly was an insensitive bastard. Jason turned around and headed for the exit, leaving behind a feeling of disgusting residue. Andrew looked at Layla. Are you okay? She took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. Yes, thanks for intervening. Andrew chuckled. Like I said, I don't like it when women talk to trash. Layla looked into his eyes and for the first time saw in him not just a cold and confident man, but a person who perhaps understood her pain better than she thought. After Jason left, Layla felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. She tried not to show it, but Andrew noticed how tense she was. Do you want to unwind a little? He asked, finishing his whiskey. Layla looked up at him. She did not want to return home to an empty apartment where she would again be alone with her thoughts. What do you suggest? She asked carefully. Come to my place, Andrew answered calmly. Let's drink something. Let's talk. Layla hesitated, But deep down, she knew that she wanted this. She nodded. Andrew brought her to his home, to a spacious, stylish penthouse with panoramic windows and a minimalist interior. The air smelled of expensive whiskey and men's perfume. Layla looked around with interest, her gaze lingering on the shelves with books and expensive works of art. "You live beautifully," she remarked, taking off her coat. "Everything is so cold. It's like no one lives here." "I don't get attached to a place," he answered briefly, walking into the kitchen. "Wine or whiskey?" "Wine," she answered, sitting down on the sofa. Andrew poured glasses, handed one to her, and sat down next to her. "So," he said, "tell me something about yourself that I don't know." Layla thought about it, taking a sip. "I think after tonight you already know too much about my drama," she chuckled. "But, seriously, I work in the field of design. I've been dreaming about my own project for a long time, but for now I'm just gaining experience." "Design?" Andrew asked with interest. "Interiors, graphics, and fashion. I wanted to create my own brand, but," she shrugged, "there are too many buts." She looked at him and smiled slightly. "Maybe. And you? What motivates you?" Andrew took a sip of whiskey, studying her with his eyes. "The goal," he answered. "There was always a goal. To achieve everything so that no one else can break me." "Nobody," Layla clarified, feeling that he was speaking for a reason. Andrew looked away. "There are different things in life," he said after a pause. "Sometimes the lessons are given too harshly, but they teach you not to make mistakes twice." Layla felt that he did not want to go deeper. She took a sip of wine as well, letting the silence fall between them. "But still," she said, leaning forward a little, "sometimes mistakes make us who we should be, even if they hit us hard." Andrew looked at her. Her eyes were warm and attentive. He knew it was wrong, that he should not delve into it now either mentally or physically, but something about her knocked him out of his usual rhythm. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly. Layla smiled slightly, but before she could say anything, he was already leaning closer to her. Her breathing paused and then quickened when his lips touched hers. Slowly at first, as if testing, but soon the kiss became deeper, more demanding. Layla didn't move away. Her fingers slid along the back of his head, pulling him closer. Andrew ran his hands over her waist, feeling how her body reacted to him. They were in no hurry. The clothes fell off gradually, fingers unfastened the buttons, lips left light touches on the skin. He explored every line of her body, memorizing every reaction, every moan. Layla arched towards him, her nails digging into his back as he covered her with himself, moving slowly but surely. She felt how the tension disappeared with every movement, how the pain of the past dissolved in this moment. Andrew was different, not like her ex, not like the men who tried to make her theirs. There were no promises or words in his touch, only confidence and understanding. Her fingers slid over his skin, her breath merging with his. This night was more than just sex. It was a moment in which they both found respite from their pasts by losing themselves in each other. When it was all over, Layla lay next to him, listening to his breathing. He didn't speak, he just ran his hand over her back, as if remembering. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel something real for the first time in a long time. After that night, something changed. Layla and Andrew were no longer just two people who happened to end up in the same bed. Their meeting, their conversations, touches, all this left a mark that was impossible to ignore. Andrew wasn't one to let anyone into his life easily, but Layla didn't try to force her way into it. She was simply there, naturally, unobtrusively, but every day she penetrated deeper into his thoughts. He was used to living alone, but now returning to an empty apartment when she was not there suddenly became unpleasant. They started spending more time together. Meetings in cafes, walks around the city, dinners at his house. They talked about everything, about life, about work, about fears and dreams. Layla talked about her childhood, about how her mother always supported her dream of having her own fashion brand. Andrew shared his past carefully, without revealing all the details, but Layla felt that he was more honest with her than with the others. At some point, Layla realized that she fell in love. Not because he was rich, successful, or handsome, but behind his cold-blooded mask was a man who once experienced so much pain that he decided to never allow anyone to cause it again. But what to do with this love if Andrew is not the type to build relationships? The first serious conflict occurred a few months later. Layla began to notice that Andrew, despite their closeness, never talked about the future. They spent nights together, but he did not invite her to live with him. He bought her expensive gifts, but never spoke words of love. And one day, on another evening over a glass of wine, she asked a question that had been tormenting her for a long time. "Who am I to you, Andrew?" He looked up at her, as if not understanding where she was going with this. "What are you talking about? You never talk about the future. We simply exist in the present, but where does this lead?" There was no accusation in her voice, only fatigue. Andrew thought about it. He knew that this conversation would happen sooner or later, but he was not ready for it. "Layla, if you don't want anything serious, just say it," she interrupted. "I don't require promises, but I'm not a toy. I want to know if we have a chance. Or are you just used to having me around?" He looked at her for a long time, silently. Two feelings fought inside him: the fear of losing control and the fear of losing her. "You are important to me," he finally said, "but I don't know how to be otherwise." Layla sighed. She understood that he was telling the truth. He is not someone who is used to intimacy, to real affection, but she needed more. "Then figure out what you want, Andrew," she said, standing up, "because I can't wait forever." She walked away, leaving him in silence, and for the first time in a long time, he felt fear. Real, icy fear at the thought of losing her. The following days were torment for Andrew. He was used to calculating everything in advance, controlling every situation, but this did not work with Layla. She simply came into his life and swept away all his rules. He understood that if he didn't take a step now, he would lose her, and he could not allow this. The decision came unexpectedly. One day he walked into a jewelry store just to look, and when he saw the thin diamond ring, he suddenly realized that he didn't want to doubt anymore. He just wants Layla to be there, always. Andrew was never a romantic, and his proposal was not a classic one. That evening, he simply came to Layla, entered without a word, took out a box, and opened it in front of her. "Marry me." Layla froze, looking first at the ring, then at him. "Andrew, are you serious?" "I don't know how to speak beautifully, Layla," he answered calmly, "but I know that I don't want to live without you. Is this serious enough?" Layla laughed through her tears. "Yes, that's enough." She took a step towards him, allowing him to place the ring on her finger, and then kissed him. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where they now had a future. Preparing for the wedding became a real fairy tale for Layla. She didn't believe that this moment had really come. Andrew, although not one for displays of affection, did everything he could to make her feel special. Their wedding was not just a celebration, but a symbol of the fact that even the most closed hearts can open the door to love. Andrew's best friend, Michael, was the best man at the wedding. He stood confidently next to the groom, watching the ceremony with a grin. Michael always supported Andrew, was the one who knew him from his youth, who saw him become what he is now. He raised a glass to them and made a warm toast, which contained genuine admiration for their history. As she walked down the aisle towards him, catching the admiring glances of the guests, her heart beat faster. Andrew looked at her as if no one existed. At that moment, she realized that her choice was right. "I vow to be with you no matter what," he said, putting the ring on her. "And I'm with you," she answered, smiling. When their lips met in a kiss, Layla knew that this was not the end of the story. This was just her new, most important stage. After the wedding, Layla and Andrew's life truly seemed like a fairy tale. They honeymooned in the Maldives, enjoying the privacy, the sun, and each other. Every day was filled with laughter, passion, and lightheartedness. Layla felt like the happiest woman in the world. She married the man she loved and believed that now everything would be perfect for them. Andrew has changed too. He was no longer the cold and distant person she knew him to be at the beginning of their relationship. He took care of her, pampered her with gifts, and paid attention to her. Their nights were filled with passion, and their days were filled with ease. He did everything to make her feel wanted, the only one. Every morning he woke her up with hot coffee and a light kiss, and at night their bodies merged into one, blurring the boundaries between desire and love. Sex between them was not just physical intimacy, but something more. They studied each other, explored the boundaries of their desires. Andrew was passionate, confident, but allowed himself to be gentle with her. Layla felt that this was not just a habit for him or a way to release tension. He wanted her as much as the first time. Every touch was filled with meaning, and this brought them closer and closer. After returning home, the fairy tale continued. Andrew arranged for Layla the home of her dreams, a stylish, spacious mansion where everything was done the way she wanted. They often had romantic dinners, spontaneous trips, nights when they couldn't keep their hands off each other. Friends were jealous of their ideal marriage, and Layla was sure that she had found her true love. She planned to open her own clothing brand, and Andrew supported her in everything. But over time, something began to change. At first, it was little things. Andrew began to stay late at work, returning late when Layla had already fallen asleep. In the mornings, he left earlier than usual, leaving short notes instead of kisses. Their conversations became shorter and shorter, and sometimes at dinner they could spend time in silence. Layla felt that his thoughts were somewhere far away, but he did not share his experiences with her. She tried not to pay attention to it. I told myself that he was just going through a stressful period at work, that everything would work out. But the feeling of anxiety inside her grew. The evenings, which had previously been filled with passion, became increasingly colder. Even in those rare moments when they were alone, Layla felt some kind of wall between them. At these moments, Michael was nearby. Andrew's best friend, their best man at the wedding, he always took the time to listen to her. He knew how to make her laugh, how to distract her from bad thoughts. He was easy, comfortable, and he was there when Andrew couldn't be. Michael suggested going to an exhibition, sitting in a cafe, just taking a walk, and Layla caught herself thinking that she wanted to spend time with him. He was lively, open, attentive the way Andrew was at the beginning of their relationship. She didn't notice how gradually their friendly conversations became more and more personal, and the moments spent together became more and more important to her. She began to trust Michael more than anyone, telling him what she was afraid to tell even herself. Andrew sat in his office, looking at the numbers on his laptop screen, but his thoughts were far away. He knew that Layla felt lonely. He noticed how her gaze became more and more distant, but he could not do anything about it. At least that's what he told himself. The work required more and more time, the deals became more complicated, and his desire to provide his wife with an ideal life gradually overshadowed Layla herself. There was a knock on the door, and Michael entered the office. He had 2 glasses of whiskey in his hands. "You look like you need it," he said, placing one of the glasses in front of his friend. "Are you working without rest again?" Andrew took the drink, took a sip, and leaned back wearily in his chair. "Did something happen?" Michael asked, sitting down opposite. "Nothing I can't handle," Andrew answered curtly, but Michael just grinned, taking a sip from his glass. "Yes, does your wife think so too?" Andrew frowned and looked at his friend over his glass. Michael's gaze was piercing, almost searching. "What are you getting at?" he asked, slightly annoyed. "You know that Layla feels lonely," Michael continued calmly. "I see the way she looks when you go to work again. Cancel your plans again. She wants attention, Andrew. She wants a husband, not a sponsor." Andrew clenched his jaw, but didn't answer right away. He knew Michael was right. Layla changed. Her smile now appeared less and less often, and in her eyes there was no longer that warm light that he loved so much. But what could he do? Stay? Give up everything? For what? For the sake of emotions? "I'm doing this for her," he finally said. "For our sake. I want her to not need anything, so that she can have everything she dreams of." "Money is good," Michael nodded. "But do you really think that she needs it now more than you do?" Andrew looked at his friend silently. Doubts fought inside him. Yes, he wanted to give Layla everything. But if he loses her, is the gamble worth it? "I heard that she spends a lot of time alone," Michael continued, or not completely alone. Andrew raised his head sharply. The look became cold. Do you know something? His voice became dangerously even. Michael pretended to think, leaning back in his chair. He seemed to enjoy the tension he caused. I'm just saying that a woman who doesn't have enough attention starts looking for it in other places. This is not a threat, friend. This is reality. Andrew gripped his glass until his knuckles turned white. He didn't even want to think about it. Layla loved him. He was sure of it. But Michael planted the seed of doubt. If you really love her, Michael added quietly, maybe you should ask her herself what she's missing. Andrew didn't answer. He just silently took another sip of whiskey, watching his friend look at him with some strange mixture of friendly concern and something else, less obvious but alarming. Andrew couldn't get Michael's words out of his head. He didn't want to admit that he was missing something, but his friend's cold voice continued to ring in his thoughts. She's losing you, Andrew. Maybe he really went too far by putting work before marriage. That same night, when he returned home, for the first time in a long time, he did not turn on his laptop or pick up his phone. Instead, he walked into the living room, where Layla was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket and leafing through a book. She looked up as he entered. You're early today, she said in surprise, closing the book and putting it aside. Andrew sat down next to her and reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He suddenly realized how long it had been since he had touched her just like that, without reason, without haste. I want to spend the evening with you, he said quietly. Layla blinked in surprise and then smiled slightly. Did your job really allow you to take a break? There was a slight mockery in her voice, but also joy. I think I've put off what's really important for too long, he admitted. I want to fix everything. She looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand how serious his words were. Then a slight smile touched her lips, but doubt was still visible in her eyes. And what do you want to do? First, cook dinner together, he said, getting up. And then, he leaned closer, his voice deeper. Then I want to remember how much I love you. Layla's cheeks turned slightly pink, but she nodded. Together they went to the kitchen, where they prepared dinner with smiles and occasional kisses. He made fun of her clumsy attempts to cut vegetables, and she responded by smearing flour on his nose, causing him to laugh heartily. It was so homely, so warm, that Layla felt for a moment as if their problems had never existed. Later, when dinner was finished, Andrew walked up to her, took her hand, and pulled her closer. I want you, Layla. His voice was filled with sincere desire. She responded not with words, but with a kiss long, deep, as if trying to absorb this moment. Andrew picked her up without breaking the kiss and carried her into the bedroom. He slowly undresses her, studying every line of her body, proving with every touch how much she means to him. Their bodies intertwined in a single rhythm, passion flared up. But this time there was something different in it, not just physical desire, but the need to become closer again, to truly feel each other again. Layla moaned his name, arched under his touches, and he looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. His every movement was conscious, every touch filled with desire. He didn't just take her, he studied her again, remembering her every moan, every tremble of her body. He wanted her to know that he was here, he was close, and he would not let them lose each other. When it was over, they lay next to each other, breathing heavily. Layla ran her fingers over his chest, feeling his heart beating evenly, and asked quietly, Do you really want to change everything? Andrew covered her hand with his, gently ran his fingers over her wrist, and kissed her forehead. Yes, I won't let us lose each other. Layla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he would really change, that this evening is not just a flash of emotions, but the beginning of something new. But a shadow of doubt still remained somewhere deep inside. Weeks passed, then months. Andrew kept his word. He began to spend more time at home, paying attention to Layla, organizing unexpected candlelit dinners, taking her out on small trips where they could escape from everyday worries. Their marriage seemed to blossom with renewed vigor, and Layla began to believe that all the shadows of the past had finally dissipated. They talked about the future, about home, about children. Layla had long wanted a child, and now that their relationship was strong again, she decided to talk to Andrew about it. One evening, lying in his arms after a passionate night, she said quietly, "Have you ever thought about becoming a father?" Andrew ran his hand through her hair, looking thoughtfully at the ceiling. "I thought," he answered after a pause. "But before I thought I wasn't ready. And now." Layla raised herself up on her elbow and looked into his eyes. "Now." Andrew chuckled and pulled her closer. "Now I can't imagine my life without you. And if you want a child, then I want that too." Layla smiled and kissed him. Thus began their attempts to become parents. At first it was exciting, pleasant, even fun. They turned every attempt into a game, rejoiced, and dreamed. But months passed, and there was no result. At first Layla wasn't worried. She told herself that everything has its time. But with each passing month, her anxiety grew. She began marking days on the calendar, reading articles, looking for advice. When, 6 months later, nothing had changed, she began to really worry. But they did not give up. Andrew tried to support Layla, reminding her that the main thing is not the result, but their love and desire to be together. They kept trying, enjoying every moment of intimacy, believing that one day fate would smile on them. Andrew didn't like leaving Layla alone, but the business trip was important. A couple of days in Boston, meeting with investors, he knew that this would strengthen his position in business. Before leaving, he tenderly kissed her temple, whispering, "I'll be back soon. Don't be bored." Layla smiled and nodded, but felt empty inside. As soon as the door closed behind him, the silence of the house seemed unbearable to her. She didn't want to be left alone again with her thoughts about why they still couldn't have a child. In the evening, she decided to go out. A bar seemed like a good idea, some wine, light music, other people's conversations that you could eavesdrop on without participating. She ordered a glass of white and had just taken the first sip when she heard a familiar voice. "You look like you need some company." Layla looked up and saw Michael. He stood in front of her, grinning, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand. His appearance was unexpected, but strangely welcome. He was a part of their life, her husband's best friend, a person who was always there. "Michael," she nodded at him, "what are you doing here?" "Same as you." "I'm relaxing." He sat down opposite. The lonely wife of a businessman shouldn't be so sad. Layla sighed and took another sip. "Everything is fine. It's just..." She hesitated, but then suddenly exhaled. "It's just that Andrew and I are trying to have a baby. It's been a long time, and nothing comes of it." Michael looked at her carefully. "Have you talked to him about this?" "Yes, but..." She shrugged. "He pretends that everything is fine, and I feel wrong." Michael leaned closer, his voice softer. "You're perfect, Layla. Just maybe you need to relax a little. You're pushing yourself too hard." She sighed. The wine pleasantly fogged her head, made her words freer, her movements easier. They drank more. Michael ordered cocktails, joked, and Layla laughed for real, for the first time in a long time. At some point, she felt that she had too much. "My head was spinning, my body was becoming weak. I I guess it's time for me to go home," she muttered, trying to get up, but her legs gave way treacherously. Michael was immediately nearby, supporting her. "It's okay," he whispered. "Let me take you." She nodded without thinking. He paid, helped her to the car, and put her in the passenger seat. Layla leaned on her back, closing her eyes. She felt drunk, but strangely calm. When she opened her eyes again, they were no longer at her house. "Where are we?" she whispered, recognizing Michael's apartment. "You couldn't stand on your feet. I didn't want to leave you alone," he said calmly, helping her out. "Come on, I'll give you some water. You can lie down for a while." She didn't resist. Everything was swimming inside, and his hands were so confident, so reliable. He led her into the bedroom and sat her down on the bed. Layla looked at him, at his lips, at his dark eyes. Something inside her trembled. "Michael," she whispered. "Hush." He tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering at her temple. You are beautiful. And so, lonely. She closed her eyes, feeling his fingers slowly slide down her neck to her shoulder. Wine, the warmth of his body, touches everything mixed into one fog. She knew she had to stop. She knew she was making a mistake. But when he covered her lips with his, she did not pull away. His kiss was insistent, confident, leaving no choice. He slowly lowered her onto the bed, his fingers deftly undoing the zipper on her dress. We shouldn't, she whispered barely audibly. Then stop me, his voice was hoarse, his breath hot on her skin. She didn't stop. Layla did not resist when his lips slid along her neck, when he removed her clothes, when his hands confidently ran along the curves of her body. She arched towards him, her body yielding to his every movement. He moved confidently, persistently, and she was drowning in this madness. That night, Layla betrayed Andrew for the first time. Layla woke up with a heavy head. The temples throbbed, the mouth was dry, and the body felt exhausted. She groaned as she rolled over and immediately realized that something was wrong. The sheets were not hers. The bed smelled of someone else's perfume. The room was in twilight, the morning rays of the sun were breaking through the curtains. And someone was lying next to her. The heart skipped a beat. She suddenly opened her eyes and saw Michael. He lay next to her, half covered with a blanket, with a satisfied smile on his face. His bare chest rose and fell slowly, and his hand rested on her waist. Panic shot through Layla. Memories of last night came flooding back. The bar, the alcohol, Michael, his hands on her body, hot kisses, moaning words, clothes falling to the floor. Her heart began to pound and her stomach clenched into a knot. Oh God. She breathed, quickly sitting up and pulling the sheet over herself. Michael lazily opened his eyes and grinned. Good morning, beauty. Damn. Layla grabbed her temples with her fingers, hoping that this was all just a nightmare. Michael, what are we? Are you serious? He grinned, pulling himself up on his elbow. Are you saying that you don't remember anything? She froze. The memories were vague, fragmentary, but clear enough for her to understand that all this was not just a drunken fantasy. She remembered how she whispered his name, how she arched under his hands, how she herself reached out to him, throwing off the last remnants of doubt. It was a mistake, she whispered, her voice shaking. Michael didn't look upset. He just tilted his head slightly, watching her. Maybe, his voice was low and calm. But that doesn't change the fact that it happened. That you wanted it. No. Layla shook her head. I was drunk. I didn't mean to. Is it true? Michael sat closer. His warm palm lay on her thigh. You were too drunk to stop, but not so drunk that you didn't want to. You kissed me, called me, moaned my name. Layla closed her eyes, her breathing hitched. It was a mistake. A colossal mistake. We have to forget about this, she breathed. This should never have happened. Michael smiled, slowly running his fingers down her back. Certainly. He bowed his head to her ear. This is our secret. Nobody will know. She shuddered. She wanted to run away, wash, get dressed, wipe it off. But fear, shame, and some dark, nasty part of herself forced her to remain in place. Michael handed her her dress, gently touching her wrist. You can leave, Layla, if you want. There was no mockery in his voice, only confidence. Or you can stay. Her fingers clenched the fabric, her thoughts racing in chaos. She knew that this was the end of her old life. She betrayed Andrew. But why didn't part of her feel remorse? She slowly pulled the dress over her head, trying not to meet Michael's gaze. He watched silently, his slight smirk never fading. When Layla stood up, her legs were shaking slightly. I need to go, she muttered, heading towards the exit. Of course, Michael answered calmly, watching her. But Layla. She stopped at the door, clutching the handle. What? If you think that it was something accidental, then you are mistaken. There was undisguised confidence in his voice. This is just the beginning. Her breath caught. She didn't look back. She simply opened the door and jumped out, feeling how everything inside was turning over. It was a mistake. A gigantic, monstrous mistake. Layla hurried home like a fugitive hiding from a crime. She wanted to forget about that night, erase it from her memory, convince herself that it was just a mistake, an impulse caused by alcohol and suppressed emotions. Opening the door, she paused, taking a deep breath. The house was the same as she had left it, cozy, warm, filled with memories. But now, within these walls, she felt like a stranger. Everything here reminded her of her life with Andrew, of the love she betrayed. She rushed into the shower, hoping that the hot water would wash away not only the traces of the night, but also the guilt. She rubbed her skin until it turned red, but the internal feeling of dirt did not go away. When she came out of the bathroom, the phone vibrated. It was Andrew. "Hello, love." His voice was warm, as always. "I'm already at the airport. I'll be home in a couple of hours." Layla swallowed, clutching the phone in her hands. I missed you so much," she said, and it was true. But now this feeling was mixed with growing fear. "Me too. I can't wait to see you. Love you." She closed her eyes, pursing her lips. "And you," she squeezed out. When Andrew entered the house, Layla greeted him with a smile, but inside she was choked with anxiety. He placed the suitcase by the door and immediately pulled her into a tight hug. "Damn, I missed you so much," he muttered, burying his face in her hair. Layla hugged him tightly, smelling the familiar smell of his perfume. He was so familiar, and she suddenly realized that she was afraid to meet his gaze. "How was the trip?" she asked quickly, pulling away. Andrew shrugged. "Ordinary meetings, negotiations. But I thought about you all the time. How are you here without me?" Layla forced herself to smile. "Everything is fine. I was a little bored, but I managed." He looked at her carefully. "You look tired. Is everything all right?" She looked away, hiding the trembling in her voice. "Of course, I just missed you." Andrew ran his fingers over her cheek, then kissed her, slowly, deeply, as if he was trying to remember the taste of her. Layla froze and then sharply kissed him back, pulling him closer. She didn't know if she was trying to numb the guilt or if she was just desperate for reassurance that Andrew was still hers, that she was still his wife. He picked her up and carried her into the bedroom. Layla hungrily clung to him. Their kisses became more and more desperate. She wanted to dissolve in this moment, forget herself, convince herself that nothing had changed. When their bodies merged together, Layla closed her eyes, trying not to think about the fact that just recently she had given herself to another in the same way. But her thoughts did not give her rest. And for the first time, she felt fear, not that Andrew might find out, but that part of herself no longer belonged to him. Andrew didn't like going back to his parents' house. The ghosts of the past still hovered within these walls, reminding him of what he had lost. After his father's death, the house was empty for a long time, but now he decided to sell it. To do this, it was necessary to dismantle old things, and this prospect did not please him. The house smelled musty, the furniture was covered with sheets, and dust had settled on the floor. Andrew walked through the rooms, remembering his childhood, the mother who smiled at him at breakfast, the father who taught him to drive. All this is a thing of the past. He went up to the attic, where old boxes of documents were stored. It was mostly bills, letters, and unnecessary papers, but one name caught his attention. This was his medical record. He didn't remember ever seeing her before. Unfolding the yellowed pages, he began to read, and froze. Patient, Andrew Kane. Diagnosis, complication of viral orchitis, infertility. The eyes slid over the lines, but the meaning of the words did not immediately reach consciousness. Infertility. He read it over and over again, hoping he was wrong, but no. The diagnosis was confirmed by tests, and the doctor's signatures were next to it. Andrew felt a lump rise in his throat. He mechanically sank down onto the old chair, continuing to hold the sheets of paper in his trembling fingers. As a child, he was seriously ill. He remembered this. But no one told him that the disease had robbed him of the opportunity to have children. The last months flashed through my head. All their attempts with Layla, her hopes, her disappointment. He told himself that everything needed time, that sooner or later everything would work out. But now he knew the truth. It will never work. He could never have children. His hands clenched into fists, the paper crumpled under his fingers. How could his mother hide this from him? Why didn't father ever tell? Why is he learning about this only now, when Layla hopes that she will soon become a mother? Pain throbbed in my temples. Everything inside was burning with anger and despair. He didn't know what to do. Should I tell Layla? Pretend nothing happened? How can we now live with this knowledge? Andrew was driving home, but his thoughts were far away. The documents he found in his parents' house could not leave his mind. He couldn't just accept it. There must be a mistake. There must be a chance. Gripping the steering wheel, he turned sharply into the parking lot near the medical center. He wasn't going to waste time. If he has any chance, he should know this. Now. The reception area smelled of antiseptic, and there were posters with advice for expectant parents on the walls. Andrew's stomach tightened, but he took the ticket and sat down, waiting. The people around looked relaxed. Someone was scrolling through their phone. Someone was chatting with their wife. And he sat clenching his fists until his fingers turned white. Andrew Kane? The nurse's voice finally rang out. He stood up, straightened his shoulders, and entered the office. The doctor was elderly, with an attentive gaze over his glasses. "How can I help?" he asked calmly. Andrew wasn't one to beat around the bush. "I need tests. Fertility check." "Full," he said firmly, barely suppressing the trembling in his voice. The doctor nodded without asking any further questions. "Fine. Come along, I'll explain the procedure. The results will be ready in a few days." A few days. They will become real torture for Andrew. The last few days have been a real challenge for Layla. She felt weak, sick in the morning, and sometimes dizzy. At first, she attributed everything to fatigue and changeable weather, but when the delay became too obvious, suspicion arose within her. She made an appointment with the doctor, hoping it was just a glitch. But when the doctor, smiling, handed her a piece of paper with the test results and said, "Congratulations, you are pregnant," the world turned upside down for her. Pregnant. Layla couldn't believe it right away. She looked at the doctor, at the documents, at her reflection in the mirror opposite, and tried to understand. For many months, she and Andrew tried to conceive a child, and nothing worked. And now, when she had almost come to terms with the fact that perhaps they were destined to live without children, fate suddenly gave them such a gift. She pressed her hand to her stomach, unable to hold back her tears. Joy covered her in a wave. Now everything will change. Now they will not just be spouses. They will become a family. Layla couldn't wait to tell Andrew. That same day, a few kilometers away, in a cold white office, the world was falling apart for her husband. Andrew sat opposite the doctor, his back tense, his fingers clenching the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. The doctor looked at him with sympathy over his glasses. "I understand that this is difficult, Mr. Kane, but the results leave no doubt," he said slowly. "Unfortunately, you are infertile. You will never have children." The words hit Andrew like a slab of concrete. Everything inside shrank. He had prepared for the worst in advance, but it was still a blow that knocked him down. He hoped that the childhood diagnosis was a mistake, that a miracle was possible. But no. "Are you sure?" His voice sounded hoarse, as if he did not belong to himself. The doctor nodded sympathetically. "Yes, the analyses leave no doubt." Andrew nodded, but everything inside him was crumbling. He got up, slowly walked out of the office, got into the car, and just sat there, staring at one point. Everything he believed in, everything he wanted, collapsed in an instant. But an even greater nightmare lay ahead. He drove home on autopilot. Thoughts were scattered, emotions rushed from rage to emptiness. He didn't know how to tell Layla. What should I tell her? That he's not the one she chose for her family, that he couldn't give her what they dreamed of. He entered the house, heavily closing the door behind him. "Layla," he called, feeling a strange cold inside. She ran out of the kitchen to meet him. Her eyes shone, her lips stretched into a wide smile. He hadn't seen her this happy for a long time. "Andrew," her voice trembled with happiness. "I'm pregnant." Andrew froze. The world around me froze. His breathing hitched. His chest was squeezed by an invisible vice. Her words echoed in his ears, and the doctor's words floated before his eyes, still fresh, like a red-hot blade piercing his consciousness. Unfortunately, you are infertile. You will never have children. Andrew, Layla looked at him with concern. Did you hear? I'm pregnant. We're having a baby. His lips trembled slightly, but he could not squeeze out a word, because he knew the truth. This child is not his. Andrew felt everything boiling inside, but he knew now was not the time. He couldn't just go wild, scream, demand an explanation. If Layla cheated on him, she shouldn't understand it yet. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to smile, even though it was difficult. This is incredible, he said, cursing himself for how false it sounded. Layla laughed with relief and hugged him again, pressing her whole body against him. I was so afraid that you wouldn't be happy. But this is a miracle, isn't it? We will become parents. Her voice trembled with joy, and Andrew almost unclenched his arms as he hugged her back. There was only one thought running through my head. Whose parent will you become, Layla? He allowed himself to linger in her embrace longer than usual, inhaling the scent of her hair before he carefully pulled away. Are you sure? He asked, choosing his words carefully. How long have you known? I saw the doctor today, Layla beamed. He confirmed the pregnancy. Andrew, it happened. We've been waiting so long. She said something, laughed, touched her stomach, but he no longer heard. He tried to count the weeks in his head. He needed to know exactly when this happened. And when exactly? He asked as softly as possible, hiding the tension in his voice. The doctor said about 4 weeks, Layla answered, smiling cheerfully, although I was also scheduled for an ultrasound to clarify the date. 4 weeks. Andrew felt his hands go cold. He was on a business trip. 4 weeks ago, he was out of town. This is not my child. But he couldn't give himself away. He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing out a smile again. He was a good liar. Business taught him that. This is wonderful, he said, touching her cheek. We need to celebrate. Yes, she nodded happily. Maybe tonight. I'll make a light dinner. Let's open some non-alcoholic champagne. Of course, my love, he answered, and a plan was already being born inside him. He finds out who the father is. Layla didn't expect to see Michael. When he appeared on the threshold of their house, she felt her insides tighten. He stood, as usual, confident, with a slight smile on his lips, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made her feel cold inside. Hey, Michael, come in, Andrew said, patting his friend on the shoulder. Would you like to drink something? I won't refuse, Michael answered, but his gaze slid to Layla. She quickly looked away and smiled tightly. While the men were talking, Layla felt out of place. She avoided looking in Michael's direction, but felt his gaze on her. He clearly came for a reason. An uneasy feeling arose in her chest, intensifying with each passing moment. Why is he here? What does he need? Her hands clenched into fists involuntarily when she heard Andrew's voice. Damn, I need to answer, he said, pulling the phone out of his pocket. It's for work. I'll be there for a minute. And before Layla could say anything, he went into another room, leaving her alone with Michael. She felt everything inside turn upside down. She knew Michael would take advantage of this moment. You're avoiding me, he said, taking a step closer. Nonsense, she answered sharply, but her voice trembled treacherously. Is it true? He narrowed his eyes. Then why don't you look at me? I just don't want to make a scene, Michael. Andrew could come back at any moment. She clenched her teeth, trying to control herself. Are you afraid that he will notice something? Michael tilted his head slightly to the side, watching her. Or are you afraid of me? Layla took a deep breath. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer avoid this conversation. I'm pregnant, Michael. She said it sharply, as if she was getting rid of a heavy burden. So, if you had any thoughts about us, forget it. We need to stop all this, once and for all. She expected different reactions, surprise, anger, disappointment, but not what followed. Michael didn't look shocked. On the contrary, he nodded slowly, as if only confirming his own suspicions. Pregnant? He asked again. What's the deadline? Layla blinked, not expecting such a question. About 4 weeks, she muttered. Michael raised his eyebrows and grinned. Layla, do you remember that 4 weeks ago Andrew was on a business trip? His voice was low, calm, but there was something sinister in it. The blood froze in her veins. Her breathing became heavy, as if invisible hands were beginning to squeeze her throat. There was a strange confidence in Michael's eyes that made her feel uneasy. What? Her voice sounded weak. You were with me, he said, taking another step closer. Are you sure it's Andrew? She opened her mouth, but the words were stuck in her throat. Until this moment, she had not had a shadow of doubt. But now, having heard this from Michael, she felt the ground disappear from under her feet. You're mistaken. She squeezed out. This is Andrew's child. Is it true? Michael leaned closer, almost whispering. Are you sure? Because if you're wrong, it changes everything. His voice penetrated under her skin, making her heart beat even faster. She shook her head, not wanting to hear it. No, no, no. Michael, stop, she whispered, trying to maintain her composure. Nothing will change. You shouldn't appear in my life anymore. He smiled, but there was no joy or fun in this smile, only a dark shadow of confidence. You understand that I won't just disappear like that? He ran his fingers over his stubble and leaned slightly towards her. Sooner or later, you will have to find out the truth, Layla. She wanted to say something, but then she heard Andrew's footsteps returning to the room. She retreated sharply, and Michael only slowly straightened up, putting on the mask of a calm friend again. Everything is fine? Andrew asked, glancing from one to the other. Layla forced herself to smile. Yes, of course. Michael was just telling a funny story. Her voice sounded strained, but Andrew didn't notice. Well then, let's have a drink, he smiled, handing his friend a bottle of beer. Michael took it, not taking his eyes off Layla. Here's to new beginnings, he said with a slight grin. Layla felt everything shrinking inside her, because she knew this story was just beginning. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, mindlessly looking at one point. The conversation with Michael was eating away at her from the inside like poison. She tried to convince herself that he was wrong, that he just wanted to confuse her. But his words echoed in her head over and over again. Are you sure it's Andrew? Her fingers involuntarily tightened on the fabric of her dress. She began frantically counting the days in her head. When was the last time she was intimate with Andrew? She tried to remember when she could conceive. Maybe the doctor made a mistake with the timing. Maybe the date could have moved. The more she thought, the more fear grew. If Michael is right, if the baby isn't Andrew's, the thought was unbearable. No, no, she won't allow this. Layla stood up abruptly and went to the bathroom. She looked at her reflection at her pale face, worried eyes. Taking a deep breath, she ran her hands over her stomach. This is their child. Her and Andrew. It can't be otherwise. She returned to the bedroom, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. Enough. She won't allow herself to destroy what they have. She wants to be happy, wants to see joy in her husband's eyes. I want to love him and believe in their future. And she will do it, at any cost. 9 months passed in a blur. Layla blossomed, her eyes shone with joy, and an atmosphere of happiness reigned in the house. Andrew saw how she lovingly stroked her rounded belly, how she smiled sincerely while choosing children's things, how she dreamed about the future of their family. Andrew tried to look happy too. He laughed with Layla, supported her during pregnancy, even went with her to an ultrasound, trying to play the role of an ideal husband. But there was an undying doubt inside him. It smoldered like coals in an extinguished fire, giving him no rest. Every time Layla spoke with delight about the unborn child, the words of the doctor popped up in his head. You are barren. You will never have children. He tried not to think about it. I wanted to believe that a miracle was possible, but my mind didn't allow it. And then the day came that was supposed to be the happiest in their lives. Layla gave birth to a boy. When he first held the baby in his arms, everything inside him turned upside down. They named him Ethan. He looked at the tiny face, inhaled the smell of the baby, and felt something strange. The child was beautiful, but something inside him screamed that this was not his son. This feeling did not leave him even after several days. Andrew knew he couldn't live in doubt. He made his decision. Secretly, while Layla was resting, he took a DNA sample from the child. Just a few hairs from his tiny head, enough to get answers. A few days later, he had an envelope with the results in his hands. Andrew sat in his office, looking at him as if he were a bomb ready to explode. His fingers trembled as he opened it. My eyes scanned the text, looking for the most important thing. Probability of paternity, 0%. Everything inside him tightened. The blood froze in the veins. At that moment, the world for him was divided into two and after. He's not the father. The child is not his. Layla cheated on him. His hands clenched into fists, crumpling the piece of paper. My breathing became heavy. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest. Doubts turned into reality. Now he knew the truth. Layla found the envelope by accident. She was cleaning Andrew's office when she noticed a folded piece of paper sticking out of the desk drawer. Her heart beat faster, her fingers trembled. Without thinking, she unfolded the sheet and read, "Probability of paternity, 0%. The world around me froze. The air instantly became heavy. Blood was pounding in my temples. The child is not Andrew. He knows everything. Tears came to my eyes. My breathing became ragged. How long ago did he figure this out? Why didn't you say anything? What will happen now? In a panic, she grabbed the phone and with trembling fingers dialed Michael's number. Come, now. 20 minutes later, Michael entered the house, his face tense. What's happened? He asked, looking at Layla. She rushed to him, thrust a sheet of test results into his hands, and burst into tears. He knows Michael. Her voice trembled. Andrew knows everything. He knows that the child is yours. Michael looked at the document, his face hardened. Crap. What should I do? Layla grabbed his hand, her eyes sparkling with tears. He didn't say anything, but I feel he's up to something. He was silent all these days, which means he knew, and now. SHH, calm down. Michael tried to hug her, but she pulled away. No, you don't understand. Her voice became shrill. This is not just a mistake. This is the end. He will never forgive this. Layla sobbed, covering her face with her hands. How could I screw up like that? Layla. Michael ran his hands over her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. We can handle it. You are not alone. She looked up at him, full of pain and doubt. At that moment, the door opened and the heavy sound of footsteps was heard. Not alone. A hoarse, cold voice rang out. Layla froze. Michael turned around slowly. Andrew stood on the threshold of the living room. His face was stony, but his eyes. A real storm was raging in them. Well, his voice was almost calm, which made it even more scary. So, Michael's child? Interesting. Silence hung in the room like a heavy weight. Andrew slowly closed the door behind him and took a step forward. So that's how it was, huh? Silence hung over the room like a dull veil. Layla froze, her lips trembled, her hands clenched into fists. Michael didn't move either, his gaze was intense, but he held himself confidently. And Andrew? Andrew was silent. I looked at them both like they were cornered rats. Then he slowly stepped forward, and the air in the room seemed to become heavier. So it's true, his voice was low and cold. Did you have sex with him behind my back, Layla? She took a deep breath, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Andrew, please, don't you dare say my name, he roared, abruptly approaching her. Layla instinctively recoiled. How much, huh? How many times have you climbed into bed with this bastard? That's enough, Michael said firmly, stepping between them. I won't let you yell at her. Andrew slowly turned his gaze to him, and a wry smile touched his lips. You won't allow it? He shook his head, and then, without hesitation, punched Michael in the jaw. He staggered, but stood firm. "Are you serious, Andrew?" Michael spat blood, running his hand over his lip. "Do you think this will solve the problem?" "You are my problem," Andrew barked. "You came to my house. You sat at the same table with us, knew that I loved her, and still had sex with her behind my back. I love her." Michael raised his voice. "I loved her for a long time, and this child is mine." Andrew froze. His fists were still clenched, his breathing was heavy, but now there was more than just rage in his eyes. There was an icy, piercing anger. "Great," he said with a deadly calm intonation. "Then live happily, but not here." Layla clasped her hands to her chest, tears rolled down her face. "Andrew, please." I said, "Shut up." He gave her a cold look, and then turned back to Michael. "My lawyer will send the divorce papers. When I get home, you shouldn't be here, Layla. Get away to your lover. Is this what you wanted? Now you have what you deserve." He took a few steps back, his breathing ragged. Everything inside him was screaming, demanding an outburst of anger, revenge, but he knew that this was not the end. Michael, breathing heavily, ran his hand over his broken lip and looked at Layla. "Get your things," he said. "You have no choice." "Layla," Andrew turned to her again. His voice became almost a whisper, but this only made it worse. "You destroyed everything we had. And believe me, I'm not done with you yet." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving them in deafening silence. Layla sobbed convulsively, feeling like her life had just completely collapsed. As soon as the door slammed behind Andrew, Layla felt all her strength leave her. She slowly sank onto the edge of the sofa, covering her face with her hands. The world around her was collapsing, and she didn't know how to put it back together. Michael sat down next to her and gently touched her shoulder. "Layla." His voice was soft, warm, but she could not raise her head. "It's over," she whispered. "He will never forgive me." "It's his choice." Michael took her hand. "But you are not alone. I'm here. I was always there for you, even when I couldn't be with you the way I wanted." She looked up at him with reddened eyes. "Michael, I don't know what to do. I destroyed everything. I can't just go ahead and start over." "But you must," he said softly. "Now it's just you, me, and our son. You are not alone, Layla. I love you. I loved you even before you became Andrew's wife. And now that everything has been revealed, I can't just step aside." She looked at him, torn between fear, guilt, and despair. Yes, Michael was close to her. He cared about her. But could he replace Andrew? She didn't know the answer herself. "Michael, what if I can't love you the way you want?" she whispered. He smiled and squeezed her hand tighter. "Then I'll wait. I don't need your love right now. I need you and our child. Give me a chance, and I will prove that we can be a family." She closed her eyes. Everything was too confusing, but one thought haunted her. If she rejected him now, she would be left alone. With a child in my arms, without support, without a home, without a future. Layla took a deep breath and looked at Michael. "Fine. Let's try it." Several months have passed. Andrew filed for divorce, finally erasing Layla from his life. He plunged into work, taking on even more tasks than before. Days gave way to nights, reports, deals, trips, everything became mechanical. And at night he drank. He was drowning in casual relationships, changing women like gloves. None of them stayed longer than one night. He did not allow any of them to penetrate further than into his bed. He convinced himself that it was easier this way, that he did it, that Layla and Michael no longer have power over him. Yes, sometimes he remembered, but without pain and anger, rather with indifference. They betrayed him, and he accepted it as part of the past. Now his life took a new path, where there was no longer room for those who had deceived him. He didn't think about revenge. He just moved on. Meanwhile, Layla tried to build a life with Michael, but things turned out to be more difficult than she thought. Michael was caring, he surrounded her with attention, helped with the child, but something inside her did not allow her to feel happy. Yes, he was nearby. Yes, he was a good father. But Layla could not forget Andrew. Every time she looked at her son, She remembered his reaction, his cold gaze, his complete indifference on the day he kicked her out. Sometimes she even thought, what if things had gone differently? If she had confessed earlier, if she had tried to save their marriage. But Michael didn't know that. He believed that she was with him because she loved him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, hugging her shoulders as she once again looked out the window for a long time. "Nothing," she answered with a forced smile. But doubts were brewing inside her, and the more time passed, the stronger they became. Layla nervously tapped her fingers on her knee, looking out the car window. The rain pattered on the windshield, and the dim street lights reflected on the wet asphalt. Everything inside her was shrinking. Anxiety was spreading through her body like an unpleasant cold. "You're not even listening to me," Michael sighed, glancing at her briefly as he drove. "I hear," she muttered, without turning her head. "Then tell me, what's the matter?" His voice sounded tired. "For the last few months, it's as if you're not here. You are with me, but at the same time you are not." Layla pursed her lips. She didn't know how to answer. Everything inside her screamed that she had made a mistake. Yes, Michael was nearby. He took care of her and their son, but she could not get rid of the feeling that their relationship was not love, but forced proximity. "Michael, don't do it now," she finally squeezed out. "No, let's do it now." He squeezed the steering wheel tighter. "Because I'm tired of pretending that I don't see you moving away." She turned sharply to him. "What do you want to hear? Why am I unhappy? What do I regret? That I don't know if I made the right choice." Her voice trembled. Michael remained silent, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. His jaw tensed, and his eyes remained glued to the road. Layla saw how these words hurt him. He was in pain, but she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. "If you really think so, then why are you here?" His voice became hoarse. She didn't answer, didn't have time. The deafening sound of a horn sounded through the noise of the rain. The blinding light of the headlights hit them in the eyes. Crap. Michael pulled the steering wheel to the side, but it was too late. There was a blow. The car was thrown, the glass shattered into fragments. The world spun, then everything was swallowed up by darkness. The booming sounds of voices broke through the veil of pain. Layla opened her eyes with difficulty. The white light of hospital lamps cut across the pupils. She tried to move, but every movement felt like pain in her body. "Are you awake, Miss White?" came the doctor's voice. "You need to remain calm." Layla hardly looked at him. "Where?" "Michael." Her voice was barely audible. The doctor paused to answer, and then said softly, "I'm sorry. Your husband died before arriving at the hospital." The air rushed out of her lungs as if she had been hit in the chest. The world has collapsed again. Flashes of memories flashed before his eyes, their quarrel, headlights, a loud blow, and now he was dead. And, "My son," she squeezed out. "The child is safe. He's with your mother." The doctor looked at her with sympathy. "But, Miss White, your condition is serious. We found internal damage on you. You may need long-term treatment." Layla closed her eyes. One thought was beating in her head. She might not make it in time. She won't have time to see her son grow up. Don't have time to be near him. And then she realized she had only one way out. She needs help. And she knew who to turn to. Andrew didn't expect the visit. When he opened the door and saw Layla's mother on the threshold, everything inside sank. The woman looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands. "We need to talk," she said in a dull voice. He silently stepped aside, letting her inside. "Layla had an accident," she blurted out, barely holding back her tears. "She was traveling on business. Michael was with her. He didn't survive." Andrew tensed, but didn't say a word. His heart beat evenly, but everything inside sank. "The child was with me at that moment. He is fine," the woman continued. "But Layla, she's in serious condition. Doctors say her days are numbered. And she—" Layla's mother closed her eyes, wiping away tears. "She asks you to come. He asks very much." Andrew clenched his jaw. "For what?" His voice was cold. "What does she want from me?" "She's dying, Andrew," the woman sobbed. and she wants to see you. Talk about the child. He frowned. What's wrong with the child? She's afraid. Her voice trembled. He's afraid that she'll be gone and he'll be left without protection. She wants you to take him with you. Andrew looked down. He didn't know what to say. It was two. She's begging, Andrew. The woman's voice trembled. I understand that she hurt you, but for God's sake, she just wants to say goodbye. Please. The silence dragged on. The only sound in the room was her ragged breathing. Andrew stood looking thoughtfully at the floor. And then, after long seconds, he finally answered. Fine, I'll go. Andrew entered the hospital room and froze for a moment. The smell of medicine, sterility, and weak metal filled my nose, making my insides feel unpleasantly cold. Layla was lying on the bed. Her body was thin, haggard, like a dried tree, ready to break at the slightest touch. Her skin was almost transparent, pale, covered with numerous bruises and abrasions. On the forehead, near the temple, a deep cut was visible, sewn up with black threads. Her lips were dry, cracked, and there were dark circles under her eyes. There were tubes all over his body connected to IVs and monitors. On the right hand, there are sensors that record a weak pulse. On the left, there are traces of injections. The artificial respiration machine hissed dully in the corner, supplying oxygen, but Layla's breathing was still heavy and intermittent. When she saw him, her lips twitched into a faint smile. You came, she whispered, her voice barely audible, almost broken. He closed the door behind him, taking a few slow steps forward. A hurricane of emotions raged inside him. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, pain, pity, everything mixed into one lump. I've come, he answered evenly, without showing what was in his heart. Layla looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry for you. Her voice trembled. Every day I lived with this burden. You can't imagine how painful it is for me to know that I lost you, that I betrayed you. Andrew clenched his fists. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave, but something held him in place. I don't want to listen to excuses, Layla, he said hoarsely. This won't change anything. I know, she sobbed, but please listen to me. I don't have much time left. I just want you to know. She tried to raise her hand, but it shook as if it were made of glass, ready to shatter with any movement. He froze then, without knowing why, he allowed her to touch his palm. I loved you, Andrew. Always. Her voice became weaker, her chest heaved with effort. But I was a coward. I was afraid of loneliness, afraid that you would leave me, that I would lose the chance to become a mother. I made a mistake, and now I'm paying for it. Andrew was silent. Her words sounded in his head, but he didn't know if he believed them. Child. Layla took a deep breath. It's not his fault. Whether he's yours or not, it doesn't matter. You are the only one who can give him a future. I beg you, Andrew. Take care of him. She squeezed his hand tighter, but her fingers were as cold as marble. Please. She breathed out, barely audible. Andrew looked at her. His heart sank. He didn't know what to answer. But what he saw in front of him was not the woman who betrayed him, but a frightened, broken mother who was ready to do anything for her child. I'll think about it, he finally said. Layla nodded weakly, her lips forming a shadow of a smile. Thank you, she whispered. At that moment, her fingers weakened and her breathing became labored. The machines around her beeped with an alarming sound. Layla. Andrew frowned, but her eyes were already closed. Doctors ran into the room, and the nurse pushed him back. She has stopped breathing. Get your defibrillator ready. Andrew watched as they tried to save her, but inside he already knew, this is the end. After a few minutes, the doctor looked up at him and slowly shook his head. We're sorry. Layla was dead. Andrew stood in the hospital room, looking at Layla's lifeless body. Everything around seemed frozen. The machines no longer beeped, and the doctors had nowhere to rush. A white sheet hid her face, as if putting an end to this chapter of his life. He should have felt relief, anger, whatever, but inside there was only emptiness. Muffled footsteps were heard in the corridor. He turned around and saw Layla's mother. She looked exhausted, but there was a plea in her eyes. Andrew. Her voice trembled. Child. He clenched his teeth. Certainly. Now it all came down to the child again. Where is he? He asked after a long silence. In the children's room, she answered. I was with him all this time. But I can't do it alone, Andrew. Layla wanted him to be with you. Andrew closed his eyes. He didn't know what to feel. He cursed this day so many times, cursed her, Michael, all their lies. And now he was faced with a choice. He could have turned around and walked away, leaving everything behind. But, I want to see him, he said finally. It was quiet in the children's ward. The baby was asleep in his crib, his tiny fingers clenched into fists. Andrew stood at the door, not daring to come closer. He's a good boy, Layla's mother whispered. Calm. You didn't even hold him in your arms, did you? He shook his head. She stepped forward, carefully picked up the baby, and handed it to Andrew. He froze, but then extended his arms, and the child was in his arms. Warm, alive, real. She named him Oliver, the woman said. Andrew looked at the baby. Something shook inside. Even if it was not his son, even if he was born from betrayal, but now he was holding him, and this feeling made his heart clench. What will you do? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. For several seconds, he simply looked at the child, and then he said firmly, I'll take him. Several days passed. Layla's funeral was quiet. It was cloudy, and the light rain was tapping on the gravestones. Andrew stood a little further away from the others, holding the baby in his arms, watching as the coffin was lowered into the ground. He didn't know what he should feel. Grief, relief, forgiveness. All he knew was that now his whole life had changed. A few months later, Andrew sat in his house, watching Oliver sleep in his crib. He was already accustomed to his presence, to these quiet nights when the baby woke up, demanding attention. I got used to the fact that I am now responsible for a small life. He thought about Layla for a long time, about the past, about pain, but now none of that mattered. He couldn't change what happened. He could only move forward. Andrew leaned down, carefully adjusted the blanket on the child, and exhaled. Even though you're not mine by blood, he whispered, looking at the baby, but I won't leave you. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making the right choice. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. 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 Click to